The Minds of Meaning Podcast. The Minds of Meaning Podcast. A podcast where we grow together in understanding the unique ways that God has created us. Here's our host, Austin Anderson.
Welcome to the Minds of Meaning Podcast, a podcast where we learn the unique ways that God has created us. My name is Austin Anderson. This is the second episode of the Communication Leadership Series, where we interview communication educational leaders within Christian higher education. Dr. Annalee Ward is the Director Emerita of the Wendt Center for Character Education at Dubuque University, a small Presbyterian school in northeast Iowa. Prior to her time in Dubuque, Dr. Ward spent 25 years in communication arts at Trinity Christian College in Palos Heights and has also served at Northwestern College and DePaul University. A fun fact about Dr. Ward is that she served as a writing intern for CBS TV and WBBM Radio in Chicago. She holds a PhD in communication from Regent University in Virginia, a master's in communication in rhetoric and media from Colorado State University, and she holds her bachelor's degree in speech and theater from Calvin University in Michigan. She brings knowledge and practical experience in the field of communication, which will help us find out more about how to effectively communicate with one another through various real-world examples, some of which might surprise you. Here is our conversation with Dr. Ward. I was truly looking forward to this interview with you because it looks like we have a lot of similarities within digital communication and eventually leading into careers from digital communications to higher ed. Do you mind sharing with us your career journey a bit and how you became passionate about studying the field of communication?
In some ways, communication was a default because I had so many interests. Just a wide variety of curiosities. And I thought what unites them all are some questions about how to be more effective or how to actually reach an audience, and questions about how something happens and why. So ultimately, communication is where I landed because I could do all kinds of things there.
And what kinds of things were you hoping to achieve, and did you achieve them?
Well, I didn't set out with lots of goals. I believed that higher ed meant teaching. So my goal was to be a good teacher, to be present in student lives, to help ask questions. And so I started teaching and then concluded, yes, I want my PhD. And along that journey, I had some children. I was taking a double load as a PhD student and wanting to spend time with kids a little bit along the way. And Disney films came out and it got my curiosity going. And I was also having to write for so many papers. And so one of the projects that I did was on Disney film, which ultimately led to my dissertation and the book, Mouse Morality. And that book has just opened so many doors for me, which has led to continuing questions about pop culture and communication. But along the way, I'm also Christian, and it's meant asking questions about faith and communication and faith and Disney. That's where I started so much of that research. So then that led me to many years as a faculty person chair, and then came to this University of Dubuque and moved into administration as a director of a Character Center, the Wendt Center for Character Education, and got to use all of my communication training and all of my passion for serving God in ways to facilitate and help faculty, staff, students grow on campus. It has definitely been a journey.
Let's talk about this. The idea of religious theme parks and Christian tourism. How did that come about, and what does that kind of look like in terms of studying those kinds of entities?
Well, again, coming off of Disney, I had some friends working on some publications on evangelicals and popular culture. We got to talking, and they asked me to write a chapter for a book and then another chapter. And they were curious about Disney and bit they'd heard about theme parks. And I thought, what a delight. Let me go explore this. Well, after traveling the country, interviewing people, audience members, producers, actors, I just discovered this whole world of Christian theme parks and museums. And I am curious about, why is it popular? How does it communicate, and does it accomplish the goals of those who created it? Or is it simply pandering? Or is it just a money grab? What's the motivation behind it? How does it communicate faith? And how does it express its worldview, whether it be a museum or a theme park or what have you?
So when you're saying Christian theme parks, are they like the Christian version of a Disneyland or Six Flags? Or are you more referring to things like the Ark Encounter down in Kentucky or something similar to that regard?
Both. I lumped them all together. So I looked at things like the Creation Museum, but at the time, it's gone defunct now. Holy Land Experience was intended to be this big deal theme park right next door to Universal Studios. And I tracked them. I also included things like Dollywood because it overtly has a mission statement to be Christian and to express that. So I went with a range of productions, Sight and Sound Theater, Precious Moments Chapel, to take in the sort of variety of expressions of pop culture, but it's really pop evangelical culture.
Switching gears a little bit here in terms of who are some of the people, your scholarly giants, I call them, who are some of the key people that you have researched during your time as you went through your doctorate program and even other studies that you really held on to as you've progressed through your studies?
Well, the art of rhetoric is at the heart of communication. And I think it's been so powerful to help me ask questions as a rhetorical critic of culture, of communication artifacts. Some of the giants, Augustine, Aristotle, Cicero, the historical giants of rhetoric certainly influenced me. And then when I was working on my master's degree, I did a thesis on Richard Weaver. So Richard Weaver, rhetorician from 50s, 60s, 70s, kind of in there, was a conservative, asking questions of worldview and culture and how people communicate and why, what they're really doing with their choice of words and how the choice of words reveals so much. So that influenced me. And then moving on in my program, Walter Ong and the whole trajectory of media ecology, James Carey, the world opened up when I could think about culture and communication criticism with Carey. But Walter Ong asked such good questions and studies both rhetorical history and brought them forward and made insightful observations about the shifts in our culture influenced by communication. And so that has continued to shape me. I guess along the way, your faculty, teachers, those kinds of folks, James Irving was just an incredible mentor in my master's program and really taught us to, as he would always say, just turn the idea a bit, applying rhetoric. And then in my doctoral program, Clifford Christians has had tremendous impact, Michael Graves. Again, Christians asking questions from different aspects of the prism. And then contemporary colleagues, Mark Williams, Calvin Trope, John Hatch. These folks are doing such good work, asking hard questions.
Are there any other modern voices that, in terms of communication or leadership, whether scholarly or just out there in public, that have kind of made a really good stance on what you've been studying in the midst of communication or leadership?
I didn't really study leadership.
Okay.
So other than the whole servant leadership, Maxwell and those folks, they're kind of in the back of my shaping. But in terms of current communication, I guess I'm rebelling against some of the directions that the current national conversation is about. And saying, I think we have to ask some different questions. You don't start with culture. You start with a Christian worldview and then work out from there. That's really where I've begun my work.
In the midst of communication in general, it seems like, and you're hinting at it a little bit here, the 21st century, notoriously, there's been this underlying idea that there is some division in communication, whether people aren't understanding each other as much, maybe the factor of more digital media. But in your mind, what would you say is the biggest reason why there might be this divisiveness in communication? And how can we, as a society, go ahead and potentially try to find ways to alleviate that divisiveness?
I'm absolutely convinced that's the human heart. And Scripture reminds us that out of the mouth proceeds what's in the heart. And so beginning with a recognition and understanding, an anthropology that says we are broken, people, but there's hope that there's redemption. So not being surprised by the divisiveness, because we all carry this brokenness in us. But then that said, you have to move beyond that, right? You have to move to saying, what can we do? And to me, it's key to begin listening. People speak very often out of pain, out of hurt, out of fear. So much of our divisiveness is out of sometimes self-interest, but also out of fear that I won't be able to provide for my family, fear that my way of life is disappearing, fear. I think it's absolutely critical for us as communicators to begin by listening. And once we listen, and I love standpoint theory, because you want to put yourself in another's shoes and say, how do they see the world based on their life experience? And now I can understand why this is a concern and maybe find some common ground in order to move us forward.
I love the standpoint theory idea. That's something I want to probably dig into personally more in my research, just the understanding and the differences of just why am I coming across the way I am? And more importantly, why is the person I'm talking to coming across the way they are? And understanding their background, understanding their viewpoints and how they get to that point. That's really awesome to hear. One other specialty, you hit on this a little bit with your book, but the idea of moral character in general. And that's something that I'm even balancing in morality and communication a little bit. How do those intertwine, and what specific traits of moral character entice you the most?
Well, as you can imagine, if I begin by diagnosing the problem as a human heart problem, character or identity matters. And so in order to communicate well, I go back to rhetoric and say we need good logos and good pathos and good ethos. We need to be able to have a character that communicates trustworthiness. And so to me, one of the key traits of good character is integrity. And integrity serves as what I call a bucket virtue for other virtues, because you need some honesty to have integrity, trustworthiness, but you also need things like courage and perseverance and steadfastness. You need a lot of virtues and the ability to discern what you need to lean into in order to stand firm as a person of faith, as a person of good character. And then I also would include justice and compassion. Integrity is sort of an inward growth, but that inward has to be expressed outwardly through being concerned for justice and being compassionate. So those are some of the traits I love to focus on. And then I take that work into communication. I taught communication ethics. One of the last things I wrote was on the Barmen Declaration, a document in the Reformed tradition that Karl Barth is said to have authored during Nazi Germany. And just looking at what is the church doing then as an institutional character? What kind of character, not just individual, but institutional? That's where the justice comes in, right? So
what are some characteristics that you've enjoyed being at a small liberal arts school as compared to some other setting, maybe more public or something of that sort?
I love being at a Christian institution because you can name your motivations. You can frame your studies with that worldview very overtly. You can hold one another accountable and challenge one another in love and know that you can continue the conversation because you have those common commitments. And so that even when I would challenge students with very hard things, we could come back and talk about why we do those things, why we look at these issues this way. Does it truly mean to be ethical in your communication in this situation? I love it. And I love the liberal arts because it allows us to range, right? We are not so narrow in specialty that we can't ask questions, which is why I love communication. So we can talk about the rhetoric of science or the rhetoric of music. We can talk about how to be an ethical business that is concerned both for profit and for service.
Do you find throughout your years, has there been any sort of change in the demographics of the student in terms of the knowledge coming into the collegiate experience during your vast tenure in higher education?
On the one hand, no, but on the other hand, yes. I think there is a loss of memory and ability pull from history. There's a loss of historical knowledge and a loss of respect for historical knowledge. Because so much of our world is decontextualized digitally that context seems like some old-fashioned virtue. But it really does matter when you are talking about understanding one another. So I see that. I mean, of course, everybody talks about the impact of the technology, the digital technology. And it has affected attention spans. I think what it's affected is the faculty are less willing to work hard and the students are less willing to work hard. I don't have to dig around in this idea. I can just Google it and somebody will come up with something good enough to get me through this assignment. So getting those devices tamed is a huge challenge. It just is. And yes, with every new technology, we've seen changes, right? With literacy, we lost memory. But with this compounded on the pandemic, it really affected our communicative skills and our interpersonal skills. And I think as faculty, we need to pay more attention to helping that return. And that may mean locking up devices for a time, getting more assignments where people have to look each other in the eye.
In similar vein to that, and some of my early readings in leadership communication and other similar topics as I've kind of been exploring here for a literature review in my dissertation, one thing I keep stumbling upon is the importance of nonverbal communication and its importance not in a leadership perspective, but from a communication perspective, in your opinion, does nonverbal communication deserve a lot of attention when it comes to leadership and relationships, or should the main focus in today's society be more about the delivery of the verbal message?
I'm going to quibble with the question a little bit because I come back to saying what matters the most is the motivations of the leader, because people can forgive a lot if you're willing to ask for forgiveness or if you help them see the vision. So when you're trying to communicate as a leader, your nonverbals must match. There must be the unity of the message. And I don't know what your experience is, but I have a hard time whenever anybody gets up and reads a passage or something that says, and it's a joyful experience that we have today. And I'm thinking, I don't believe you, because to me, it's the nonverbal of the voice, right? It's the tone, but it's also the energy of the body, the eyes coming alive, the nonverbals. The nonverbals are dangerous in leadership because it's also easy to mislead. So I think that genuine communication that actually is cognizant of the audience and the occasion, good old-fashioned speech 101, that says there's a larger audience, it requires bigger nonverbals just by nature of what it is. Those sorts of elements, nonverbals really matter. But if it's, sometimes you don't get the nonverbals. Much of leadership today is done via email.
That's a huge other can of worms that certainly can be discussed in that communication vein. But the last question I have for you today, and thank you again so much for your time. Christian higher education certainly has changed drastically, even in the last decade, but over a longer scope, it certainly has changed as well. And the field seems to be taking a lot of twists and turns, and a lot of different schools having some financial concerns and sadly closures in many regards. From a leadership standpoint, looking more from an experience as opposed to probably more of like a studying situation, how can Christian educational leaders be best effectively communicating with others as they navigate specific challenges that many of these similar sized schools face?
To be a leader means to have a vision for where you're going, but then to be able to communicate that, to inspire people with hope. It means to have the integrity, to be honest and strive for transparency to the utmost possible, to be consistent, to be compassionate, but always helping people work toward the big goal, giving them the why, right? That works in teaching and it works in leadership. You're helping people see why they're doing what they're doing. And bringing meaning to work is a key part of what it means to be a leader, helping that along the way. It also means catching the good and helping celebrate. Yes, Christian higher ed is only getting more challenging, but staying true to our calling staying true to our identity in Christ. It's key to leading other people and having that place to lead them to.
We really appreciate Dr. Ward taking the time out of her day to chat with us about communication and educational leadership on the second episode of the Educational Leadership mini-series of the Minds of Meaning podcast. She has spent a significant amount of time in Christian higher ed through teaching and leadership roles, and it is valuable to have someone of her experience speak to us today. Here are 3 big takeaways I took from our discussion. First, Dr. Ward talks about effective communication involving both understanding how something happens and why. Although we think deeply about communication so often, the scientific definition of communication is rather simple. Someone speaks or non-verbally conveys a message to an individual, and they process it. As a college instructor, I need to understand the consequences of what I say and why would those consequences occur. Additionally, I need to know how the other person may interact with me and why they may do so. Second, Dr. Ward is a big fan of rhetoric. To explicitly define the term, Oxford Languages cites it as, quote, the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially in the use of figures of speech and other compositional technique. I could argue that all dialogue is persuasive in some sense. In conversations with people of a similar mindset, the sender will usually seek a justification from the receiver, even though the sender knows that the receiver is likely to agree with them. In conversations with people of a similar mindset, the sender usually will seek justification from the receiver, even though the sender knows that the receiver is likely to agree with them. So could we define communication as persuasion leading to a purpose? Something to think about. Third, leaders and communicators need to have a sense of integrity, which will lead to a sense of justice. Inward integrity must be expressed outwardly to others to help spread the message of justice and integrity on certain situations. Justice and integrity can be the viewpoint of a certain individual, or it could be the viewpoint of a collective group articulating a sense of justice or compassion. Educational leaders who are in the field of Christian higher education have to realize that they are responsible for not only articulating justice and high integrity from their own perspective, but interactions with colleagues and students should also represent the institution that they are missionally aligned with. Thank you for listening to the second episode of the Communication and Educational Leadership series on the Minds of Meaning podcast. I'm Austin Anderson. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Minds of Meaning podcast. To learn more about Minds of Meaning, visit mindsofmeaning.com or Minds of Meaning on the mainstream social media platforms. God bless.